What are you doing here? Put that down before someone gets hurt.
I'm not leaving. Stay away from me.
A single silver dollar. That was the price for 100 acres of blood-soaked Montana dirt. Gabriel Mercer thought he was buying a quiet place to die. Instead, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of a freezing stable, he found a loaded gun, a desperate runaway, and a reason to live. The wind, howling through the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana in the late autumn of 1888, carried the bitter promise of a deadly winter. Gabriel Mercer felt it deep in his bones, specifically in the shattered remnants of his left femur and the surrounding scarred tissue, a brutal reminder of a wild Mustang's kick 10 years prior. That kick had broken his body, nearly ended his life, and left him with a hollow, agonizing truth delivered by a frontier doctor. He would never father children. For a decade, Gabriel had lived as a phantom in the high timberline. He was a mountain man by necessity, trapping beaver and hunting elk, hiding from a society of families and fathers that he felt he no longer belonged to. He was 39, heavily bearded, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a thick bearskin coat that made him look more like a beast of the woods than a man. But the mountain winters were growing too harsh for his aching body. He needed lower ground. He needed a roof that wouldn't collapse under 10 feet of snow. That necessity brought him down to the bustling, mud-slicked mining town of Red Willow. Red Willow was a festering wound of civilization, built on greed and cheap whiskey. Gabriel tied his pack mule, Barnaby, to the hitching post outside the Golden Spur saloon. The mud in the street was ankle-deep, churning with the boots of prospectors, outlaws, and desperate men. Gabriel pushed through the swinging doors, the sudden heat and stench of stale beer and unwashed bodies hitting him like a physical blow. He walked to the bar, dropped a few beaver pelts on the scarred mahogany, and asked for a bottle of rye. He didn't notice Levi Cobb at first. Levi was a small, rat-faced man, sweating profusely despite the drafty room, his eyes darting frantically toward the saloon doors every few seconds. Levi was drinking heavily, his hands shaking so violently that his whiskey kept sloshing onto his worn trousers. "You look like a man who knows how to hold his own," Levi muttered, suddenly sliding down the bar to stand beside Gabriel. "You look like a man who ain't afraid of the devil himself." Gabriel didn't look at him. He poured his rye. "I leave the devil to his business, and he leaves me to mine." "I got land," Levi whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. He pulled a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of heavy parchment from his coat pocket. 100 acres out by Miller's Creek. Good grazing land, a cabin, a stable. It's the old O'Driscoll place. Gabriel paused, the glass halfway to his lips. The O'Driscoll place was notorious. It sat in a shadowed valley 20 miles out of town, isolated and hard to reach. "If it's good land, why are you shaking like a leaf trying to sell it in a saloon?" "It's cursed," Levi said, his eyes wide. "Or maybe worse than cursed. I won it in a poker game 3 weeks ago. Went out there to claim it. Heard things. Seen things. Shadows moving in the timber. Hoofbeats in the dead of night when there ain't no horses around. There's a bad wind blowing through that valley, mister. I ain't going back. I need to leave Red Willow tonight on the evening train, and I need to be rid of this deed so whatever is out there knows it don't belong to me no more." Gabriel studied the terrified man. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in wind, wolves, and the cruelty of men. "What's your price?" $1, Levi gasped, slamming the deed onto the bar. "1 silver dollar, and it's yours, free and clear. The taxes are paid. I just want it out of my name." It sounded like a fool's bargain, the kind of deal that ended with a man shot in the back. But Gabriel had $1, and he needed a cabin. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver Morgan dollar, and slapped it down on the bar. Levi snatched the coin with a sob of relief, shoved the deed into Gabriel's chest, and bolted for the door without another word. An hour later, Gabriel was riding out of Red Willow, the deed safely tucked in his saddlebag. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a massive snowstorm. He rode hard, navigating the treacherous switchbacks and narrow canyons that led to Miller's Creek. By the time he breached the valley ridge, the first fat flakes of snow were beginning to fall. Below him, nestled in a grove of skeletal cottonwood trees, sat his new domain. The O'Driscoll place was a grim sight. The main cabin leaned heavily to the right, its roof missing several cedar shakes. The windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. About 50 yards away stood a large, weather-beaten stable, its heavy barn doors clapping rhythmically in the rising wind. It wasn't a home. It was a graveyard of broken dreams. But to Gabriel, it was shelter. He spurred his horse forward, leading Barnaby down the slope as the wind began to howl, ready to claim his $1 sanctuary. The storm descended with a sudden, violent fury. What started as fat, lazy flakes rapidly transformed into a blinding whiteout. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud beneath Gabriel's boots into jagged ridges. He knew from years of surviving the high country that he had only minutes to secure his animals and find shelter before the cold began to claim his extremities. He bypassed the main cabin entirely. The heavy wooden doors of the stable were clapping loudly in the gale. He grabbed the handles, fighting the fierce wind, and shoved the heavy doors open, pulling his horse and mule inside. The interior of the stable was pitch black, smelling of ancient hay, dry rot, and a strange metallic scent that Gabriel couldn't quite place. He shoved the doors shut behind him, plunging the space into near total darkness, save for the wind whistling through the cracks in the siding. He pulled a kerosene lantern from his saddlebag, struck a lucifer against his boot heel, and touched the flame to the wick. Yellow light flared, casting long, monstrous shadows against the walls. The stable was massive, built for a dozen horses, but it had been abandoned for years. The stalls were broken, the feed troughs empty. Gabriel began to unsaddle his horse, his hands numb from the cold. That was when he heard it. It was a soft sound, barely audible over the roaring wind outside. A sharp intake of breath, a rustle of dry straw from the darkest corner of the stable, back near the old tack room. Gabriel froze. His hand instinctively dropped to the heavy Colt revolver resting on his hip. He didn't draw it, but he stood perfectly still, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, scanning the back of the barn. "I know you're there," his voice rumbled, deep and calm, carrying effortlessly over the wind. "I just bought this land. Come on out, and there won't be no trouble." Silence. Then another rustle, slower this time. Gabriel picked up the lantern and began to walk slowly toward the back of the stable, his boots crunching softly on the dirt floor. As he approached the last stall, the pile of loose, moldy hay began to shift. Suddenly, a figure bolted upright from beneath the straw. The lantern light caught the glint of blue steel. A massive, double-barreled derringer was pointed squarely at Gabriel's chest. "Take one more step, and I'll put a hole in you the size of a dinner plate," a voice hissed. It wasn't a grizzly, it wasn't an outlaw, it was a woman. Gabriel stopped dead in his tracks, raising his free hand slowly. The woman holding the gun was young, perhaps no more than 22. Her face was smudged with dirt and grease, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes wide with the terrifying feral desperation of a cornered animal. Her dark blonde hair was matted with sweat and straw. She wore a man's oversized canvas coat, completely soaked through. But what made Gabriel's breath hitch in his throat wasn't the gun. It was her shape. Beneath the heavy canvas coat, her belly swelled with late-stage pregnancy. She was massive, clearly only weeks, if not days away from giving birth. "Put the gun down, miss," Gabriel said softly, keeping his voice as steady as a calm river. "My name is Gabriel Mercer. I ain't here to hurt you. I bought this place in town a few hours ago." "Liar!" she screamed, her hands shaking violently. "Jeremiah sent you. I know he did. He sent you to finish it." "I don't know any Jeremiah," Gabriel replied, his eyes locked on the trembling barrel of her gun. "I'm a trapper. Just came down from the Tetons. Look at me. Do I look like a man who works for someone else?" The young woman stared at him, her chest heaving. She took in his scarred face, the heavy bearskin coat, the snow melting in his thick beard. She lowered the gun an inch, hesitation flickering in her wild eyes. You aren't one of his deputies?" "I despise the law almost as much as I despise getting shot," Gabriel said gently. "Now, please, lower the hammer." She tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. Suddenly, a violent spasm ripped through her body. She gasped, a sound of pure agony, and dropped the gun. She doubled over, clutching her swollen stomach, her knees buckling beneath her. Gabriel moved with a speed that belied his massive frame and injured leg. He caught her before she hit the hard dirt floor, easing her down onto the straw. She was burning up. Her skin radiated heat through the thick canvas coat. A severe fever had taken hold of her, likely from exposure to the bitter cold and lack of food. "Help me," she whispered, her eyes rolling back. "Please, my baby." Gabriel stripped off his heavy bearskin coat and laid it out, gently moving her onto the thick, warm fur. He grabbed his canteens, unscrewed the cap, and brought it to her dry lips. "Drink," he commanded softly. She took a small sip, then coughed violently. Gabriel looked around the freezing stable. They couldn't stay here. The temperature was dropping too fast, and she was in no condition to survive the night in a drafty barn. He had to get her to the cabin, build a fire, and figure out how to save both her and the child she carried, a child that suddenly triggered a deep, buried ache in his own barren chest. He secured the horses, grabbed his saddlebags, and wrapped the young woman tightly in his bearskin. Lifting her into his arms, he was surprised by how light she was beneath the heavy clothing and the weight of the child. She had been starving. He kicked the stable door open and stepped out into the howling blizzard. The 50 yards to the cabin felt like 50 miles. The wind screamed, tearing at his clothes, throwing sheets of ice into his face. He shielded her body with his own, kicking the rotting door of the main cabin open and stepping into the dusty, freezing darkness inside. He laid her gently on a dilapidated wooden bed frame in the corner of the main room. Working quickly, he smashed a broken wooden chair against the floorboards to create kindling, swept out the stone hearth, and managed to get a roaring fire going within 10 minutes. The yellow light of the flames danced across the room, revealing decades of dust, broken glass, and rat droppings. But it was warm. He fetched snow from the porch, melting it in a tin pot over the fire, and found a relatively clean rag in his pack. He knelt beside the bed, wiping the sweat and dirt from her burning forehead. "What's your name, girl?" he asked quietly, as she tossed in the throes of a fever dream. "Cora!" she murmured deliriously, her hands gripping his scarred wrist with surprising strength. "Cora Miller." Gabriel froze. Miller's Creek. The land Levi Cobb had sold him for $1. The pieces were starting to click together, forming a dangerous picture. He wasn't just sitting on a piece of abandoned land. He was sitting on a battlefield, and the war was already bleeding on his floorboards. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged outside, burying the O'Driscoll cabin under 5 feet of snow. For 3 days and 3 nights, Gabriel did not sleep. He fought a relentless war against Cora's fever. He brewed willow bark tea to bring down her temperature, fed her small spoonfuls of a rich elk broth he made from his mountain provisions, and kept the fire roaring so hot that the drafty cabin felt like a summer afternoon. During the worst of it, when her fever spiked and she cried out in terror, thrashing against unseen demons, Gabriel sat beside her, talking to her in a low, steady rumble. He told her stories of the high peaks, of the eagles that nested above the clouds, of the quiet peace of the untouched snow. He didn't know if she could hear him, but it seemed to anchor her. It wasn't until the morning of the 4th day, when the wind finally died down and the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, that her fever finally broke. Gabriel was sitting in a rickety rocking chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine, when he heard the rustle of the coarse wool blanket. He looked over. Cora was awake. Her eyes, a striking shade of pale green, were clear, though shadowed with deep exhaustion. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice raspy. "It's my house," Gabriel replied, setting his knife aside. He stood up, poured a cup of warm water from the kettle over the fire, and brought it to her. "Drink this slowly." She took the cup, her hands still trembling slightly, and drank. She looked around the cabin, noting the boarded-up windows, the roaring fire, and the massive, scarred man who had saved her life. "You took my gun!" "I did," Gabriel said, sitting back down. "I find that people with fevers and firearms are a poor combination. It's on the mantel. I've cleaned it and reloaded it." Cora stared at him, bewildered by his calm demeanor. "Why are you doing this? Helping me?" "I found you half dead on my property, Miss Miller. Out here you don't walk away from a dying creature, be it a horse, a dog, or a woman, especially not one carrying a child." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But now that the storm is broke, I think it's time you told me exactly what kind of trouble I bought for $1 silver. You said a man named Jeremiah sent me. Who is Jeremiah? Cora closed her eyes, a shudder running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. Jeremiah Stone. He's the sheriff of Red Willow County. Gabriel's jaw tightened. A lawman. That complicates things. He's not a lawman, he's a butcher with a badge, Cora spat, a sudden fire igniting in her eyes. My father was Silas Miller. He owned this entire valley, thousands of acres of the richest timber and grazing land in the territory. 3 months ago, my father refused to sell his water rights to a railroad syndicate that Jeremiah was fronting for. 2 days later, my father was shot dead in the street. Jeremiah claimed it was a drunken brawl, but my father never drank. She took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. I was his only heir, but women can't hold land titles in this territory without a husband or a male guardian. Jeremiah forged a document claiming my father owed him massive debts. He seized the estate. The only way I could legally reclaim my family's land was through an heir, a blood heir. She looked down at her stomach. My father knew Jeremiah was circling. Before he died, he had my marriage to a good man, Thomas, registered in secret. Thomas was a ranch hand. Jeremiah found out. He killed Thomas a week after the wedding. Gabriel felt a cold rage building in his chest. So you ran. I ran, she confirmed. Jeremiah knows I'm pregnant. He knows that the moment this child is born and registered in the county courthouse, his claim to the Miller fortune is voided by territorial law. The federal judge comes through Red Willow next month. If I can present my child and the marriage certificate to the judge, Jeremiah loses everything. He's been hunting me for weeks. I hid in Red Willow, then paid a man named Levi Cobb all the money I had to hide me out here at the old O'Driscoll place. Levi sold me the deed to this patch of dirt, Gabriel said, the mystery of the frantic man in the saloon finally making sense. He got scared of the shadows and ran. Jeremiah's men have been patrolling the valley, Cora whispered, panic rising in her voice again. They ride by at night, trying to flush me out. Levi couldn't handle the pressure. I knew he would run. I was just waiting to die here. And then you walked in. Gabriel looked at the fire, watching the embers pulse with a deep red heat. He had spent 10 years isolating himself from the world, punishing himself for a biological failure he couldn't control. He had felt useless, a dead end of a man. But looking at Cora, looking at the child, she carried a child hunted by wolves in sheriff's clothing, something ancient and fiercely protective snapped awake inside him. You ain't going to die here, Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with absolute authority. And neither is that baby. Cora looked at him, desperately wanting to believe him. You don't understand, Gabriel. Jeremiah has 20 men, deputies, thugs, hired guns. You're one man with a bad leg. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? Gabriel slowly rolled up the left leg of his trousers, exposing the horrific, twisted scars that marred his thigh and knee. Cora gasped softly. A wild horse did this, Gabriel said softly, staring at the scars. Shattered the bone, crushed my insides too. The doctor told me I was broken, said I'd never be able to give a woman a child. Never be a father. He looked up, meeting Cora's tear-filled eyes. For 10 years, I believed my life was over, that I had no purpose because I couldn't leave a legacy. But a legacy ain't just about blood, Cora. It's about what you protect. It's about what you stand up for when the rest of the world runs away. He rolled his pant leg down and stood up, towering over the room. Jeremiah Stone wants to kill a mother and her unborn child for greed, Gabriel said, his voice hardening into steel. He ain't stepping foot on my property. You are going to have this baby, Cora. And I am going to make sure you live to show it to that federal judge. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoed through the crisp winter air outside. It was followed by the sound of shattering glass as the small, unboarded window in the loft exploded inward, raining shards onto the floorboards. Cora screamed, covering her head. Gabriel didn't flinch. He snatched his heavy repeating rifle from the table, kicked the rocking chair over to give Cora cover, and moved silently toward the front wall of the cabin, peering through a crack in the rotting wood. Through the glaring white reflection of the newly fallen snow, he saw them. 5 riders, silhouetted against the tree line at the edge of his property, wearing heavy winter dusters and tin stars pinned to their chests. They had found the trail. The storm had delayed them, but they had found her. "Stay down, Cora," Gabriel ordered, racking the lever of his rifle with a harsh, metallic clack. "The wolves are at the door." He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar, icy calm of a hunter settling over him. He had bought this land for $1 to find peace. Instead, he had bought a war, and Gabriel Mercer was entirely prepared to make them pay in blood. The first bullet tore through the rotting timber of the front door, splintering the wood and burying itself in the stone hearth. Gabriel didn't flinch. He tracked the muzzle, flashed through the crack in the wall, leveled his Winchester Model 1873, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, a deafening thunderclap in the confined space, and a man outside dropped with a choked cry, his blood staining the pristine snow. "4 left," Gabriel muttered, his voice cold and mechanical. He ejected the spent casing. It clinked sharply against the floorboards. "Gabriel!" Cora screamed, her voice tearing through the gun smoke that was already filling the room. It wasn't a scream of fear from the gunfire. It was a visceral, primal shriek of bodily agony. Gabriel whipped his head around. Cora was curled on her side on the fur coat, her hands gripping the iron rails of the bed frame so hard her knuckles were bone white. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the heavy canvas coat. The sudden terror of the ambush had triggered it. Her water had broken. "Hold on, Cora!" Gabriel shouted, ducking as 2 more rounds shattered the remaining glass in the loft. "Just hold on! They're flanking the cabin!" one of the deputies yelled from the tree line. "Burn the bastard out!" Gabriel knew he couldn't let them get close enough to throw a torch. The dry, rotting cedar of the cabin would go up like kindling. He scrambled to the boarded-up side window, kicked the bottom plank loose, and thrust the Winchester barrel through the gap. He caught sight of a man in a brown duster sprinting toward the side porch with a lit kerosene lantern. Gabriel fired. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder. He spun, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, igniting the snow and freezing mud, creating a wall of flame that temporarily blocked the side approach. But the distraction cost him. The heavy front door suddenly buckled inward with a violent crash. A massive deputy, a man named Brody with a scarred jaw and a sawed-off shotgun, burst into the room. Gabriel's rifle was pointed out the window. He didn't have time to turn it. Brody leveled the shotgun at Gabriel's chest, a cruel grin splitting his face. "Jeremiah sends his regards, Mountain Man." With a roar that tore from the depths of his chest, Gabriel abandoned his rifle. He launched his massive frame forward, ignoring the screaming agony in his shattered left leg. He hit Brody just as the man pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast went wild, blowing a hole in the ceiling as the 2 men crashed to the floor. It was a brutal, ugly fight. Brody was younger, but Gabriel possessed the raw, desperate strength of a man who wrestled wolves for his supper. Brody clawed for a hunting knife at his belt, bringing the blade up to gut Gabriel. Gabriel caught the man's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. As Brody howled in pain, Gabriel drove a crushing blow to the deputy's temple with his heavy, calloused fist. The man went limp. Gabriel scrambled up, grabbing his Colt revolver from his holster. He rushed to the doorway, firing 3 rapid shots into the blizzard to push back the remaining 2 deputies. They scrambled for the tree line, dragging their wounded, clearly deciding that a direct assault on the mountain man was a death sentence. For now, they were retreating to fetch Jeremiah and the rest of the posse. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Cora's ragged, agonizing breaths. Gabriel slammed the broken door shut, dragging a heavy wooden dresser in front of it to barricade them in. He turned back to the room. Cora was completely pale, sweating profusely, her eyes rolling back in her head. "The baby," she gasped, her body arching off the bed. "Gabriel, it's coming. It's coming right now." Gabriel's hands, which hadn't trembled once during the gunfight, suddenly began to shake. He was a trapper. He had birthed foals and skinned bears, but delivering a human child in a freezing, bullet-riddled cabin was a frontier he had never crossed. "I'm here, Cora," he said, dropping to his knees beside the bed. He threw off the canvas coat, washed his blood-stained hands in the boiling water over the fire, and moved to the foot of the bed. "I'm right here. You're going to be all right. Do you hear me? You have to push." For 2 agonizing hours, the war outside was forgotten, replaced by the fierce, exhausting battle of life entering the world. Cora fought with every ounce of her remaining strength, her screams echoing in the rafters. Gabriel guided her, his deep, steady voice serving as her only anchor in the pain. He spoke of the spring thaw, of the wildflowers that would bloom in the valley, giving her a future to fight for. Finally, with one last, earth-shattering cry, Cora collapsed back against the mattress. A sharp, piercing wail filled the cabin. Gabriel looked down through tear-blurred eyes at the tiny, red, screaming infant in his massive, scarred hands. It was a boy. He quickly cleared the baby's airways, tied and cut the cord with his sterilized hunting knife, and wrapped the furious little life in a clean flannel shirt from his pack. He gently laid the child on Cora's chest. She opened her exhausted eyes, tears streaming down her face as she pulled her son close. "Thomas," she whispered, kissing the boy's forehead. "His name is Thomas." Gabriel sat back on his heels, a profound, overwhelming emotion crushing his chest. For 10 years, he had believed himself a barren, useless branch on the tree of life. But watching the mother and child breathe in the warmth of the fire he had built, protected by the blood he had shed, he realized the truth. He was not a dead end. He was a shield. "Rest, Cora," Gabriel said softly, reloading his revolver. "The wolves will be back, but we won't be here when they arrive." 3 days later, the town of Red Willow was a frozen, muddy nightmare, but the main street was packed. Word had spread that federal judge Amos Albright had arrived on the morning train, setting up his temporary court in the town hall to settle territorial disputes. Sheriff Jeremiah Stone stood on the boardwalk outside the Golden Spur Saloon, smoking a cigar, flanked by 10 heavily armed deputies. Jeremiah was a striking, terrifying man, tall, sharply dressed, with cold, dead eyes. He had received word from his bruised deputies about the mountain man in the O'Driscoll cabin. He was gathering his posse to ride out and burn the place to the ground, when a murmur rippled through the crowd at the end of the street. The crowd parted. Coming down the center of the muddy thoroughfare was a massive mountain mule, pulling a makeshift wooden travois. On the travois, wrapped in layers of heavy bearskin, sat Cora, holding a tightly bundled infant. And leading the mule, limping slightly but walking with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche, was Gabriel Mercer. His bearskin coat billowed in the wind, his Winchester rested casually over his broad shoulder, and his eyes were locked dead on Jeremiah Stone. The sheriff's cigar dropped from his mouth. He signaled his men, who immediately stepped off the boardwalk, fanning out across the street, blocking the path to the town hall. "That's far enough, Mountain Man," Jeremiah called out, his hand resting on the pearl handle of his sidearm. "You're harboring a fugitive. That woman is wanted for the murder of her husband, Thomas. Hand her over, and I might let you ride back to whatever cave you crawled out of." Gabriel stopped 10 paces away. The entire town held its breath. "The only murderer standing in this mud is you, Jeremiah," Gabriel's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. "And this woman ain't a fugitive. She's the rightful owner of the Miller Valley, and she's got the blood heir to prove it." Jeremiah sneered. "A bastard child born in a barn doesn't prove anything. The Miller estate is forfeit. Now, I won't ask you again. Step aside." "No," Gabriel said simply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a sudden move. He just stood there, an immovable object. "Kill him!" Jeremiah snapped to his deputies. Before a single gun could be drawn, the heavy oak doors of the town hall banged open. Out stepped Judge Amos Albright, a stern man with a shock of white hair, followed by 2 federal marshals armed with repeating shotguns. "What in the name of God is this commotion?" the judge bellowed. "Judge Albright," Cora cried out from the travois, holding up a folded piece of parchment. "My name is Cora Miller. I have my legal marriage certificate to Thomas, registered in secret 3 months ago. And I have his son." The judge's eyes narrowed. He looked at Jeremiah, then at the pregnant woman, and finally at the imposing mountain man. "Bring that document here, young lady." Jeremiah panicked. He knew that if the judge saw the legitimate dated watermark on that marriage certificate, his entire empire of stolen land would crumble. His greed overrode his sense. "She's a liar!" Jeremiah screamed, drawing his revolver and aiming it directly at Cora. He never pulled the trigger. Gabriel's draw was a blur of motion. He didn't use the rifle. He drew the Colt from his hip and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet struck Jeremiah Stone squarely in the right shoulder, shattering the bone and sending his revolver spinning into the mud. The sheriff collapsed, screaming in agony. The 10 deputies, looking at the bleeding sheriff, the federal marshals, and the towering mountain man whose gun was still smoking, slowly raised their hands in surrender. Judge Albright marched into the street, snatching the certificate from Cora's hands. He inspected it, his face darkening with fury as he looked down at the writhing sheriff. "Arrest this man," the judge ordered the marshals, "and send a telegraph to the territorial governor. We have a lot of stolen deeds to reverse." The crowd erupted into cheers. The reign of terror in Red Willow was over. 2 weeks later, the spring thaw finally began to melt the snow in the Miller Valley. The Grand Miller farmhouse, previously occupied by Jeremiah's thugs, had been cleaned and restored to Cora. Gabriel stood by the paddock, adjusting the saddle on his horse. He had his heavy coat packed, his rifle secured. The job was done. The wolves were dead or caged. It was time for the Phantom to return to the high timberline. "You don't have to leave." Gabriel turned. Cora stood on the porch, holding baby Thomas in her arms. She looked healthier now. The color returned to her cheeks, her green eyes shining with a mixture of profound gratitude and something deeper. "I belong in the mountains, Cora," Gabriel said softly, looking down at his boots. "I bought a piece of land for $1. I gave it to you so you can expand the southern pasture. My business here is finished." Cora walked down the steps, crossing the muddy yard until she stood right in front of him. She reached out, her soft hand gently touching the rough, scarred skin of his cheek. "A man who fights for a family he doesn't know doesn't belong alone in the cold," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You told me a legacy isn't just about blood. It's about what you protect. You protected us, Gabriel. You saved my life. You delivered this boy." She looked down at Thomas, who was cooing softly, then looked back up, her eyes fierce. "He needs a father, a real one, and I need the man who wasn't afraid of the shadows." Gabriel stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in 10 years. He looked at the vast, beautiful valley, the warm house, the beautiful woman, and the child that he had brought into the world. He realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that he wasn't broken. He had just been waiting for the right place to plant his roots. Gabriel Mercer slowly reached out, wrapping his massive arms around Cora and the baby, pulling them tight against his chest. "All right," he whispered into her hair, a smile finally breaking through his thick beard. "I reckon $1 was a fair price for a family." What an incredible tale of survival, redemption, and frontier justice. Gabriel's journey proves that true strength isn't just about surviving the wilderness, but having the courage to protect the vulnerable and open your heart again. If this Wild West story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share it with your fellow history and drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life-inspired Western stories every week.
Hi, my name is Royal Trials, the owner and manager of Royal Trials. After watching the video, Infertile Mountain Man Bought a ranch for $1, then found a pregnant girl in the stable, I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the sense of unexpected hope running through the story. Sometimes, life takes a direction we never could have planned, and stories like this remind us that meaningful connections can appear in the most unlikely circumstances. That mix of uncertainty, compassion, and new beginnings made this one especially memorable for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which moment stood out to you the most? And do you think the most important changes in life often come from situations we never saw coming? One gentle lesson I took away is that keeping an open heart can lead to opportunities and relationships we might otherwise miss. In everyday life, that could mean being a little more understanding, a little more patient, and willing to see possibilities where others see obstacles. If the story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, a like or subscription is always appreciated. Thanks for spending part of your day with us at Royal Trials.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Infertile Mountain Man Bought a Ranch for $1, then found a pregnant girl in the stable, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the sense of unexpected hope woven through the story. Sometimes life takes a turn we never see coming, and the people we meet along the way can change our perspective in ways we never imagined. That feeling of finding purpose in an unexpected situation is something many of us can relate to. Do you think the mountain man's life changed the moment he made that discovery? Or did his character already point him in that direction? And which part of the story stayed with you the longest after it ended? It's interesting to think about how small choices can open doors to entirely new paths. One practical lesson we can take from stories like this is to stay open-minded when life doesn't go according to plan. Sometimes opportunities arrive in forms we don't expect. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Rugged Heart Man for more frontier tales.